Well, welcome back. Got another video out there about reassembling the crankcase on a 1981 Yamaha G1 golf cart, but I thought I'd do a little abbreviated version if possible. It was largely accomplished with one of these Tusk brand pullers. And a couple little tips before I forget. I would strongly recommend greasing this threaded shaft, and ideally maybe finding a bearing to slip over here, and the nut will tighten against the bearing, and then the bearing will press against this collar, because when you get this sucker under torque, it pulls hard. So anything to ease the tightening of this pulling action will greatly enhance your success rate. So the components of this are basically, you got this outside collar, you've got, I'll call it this threaded plunger or pulling rod, you've got this adapter, and then actually the nut that goes on the top of here. So if you follow the directions in the service manual, it says install the seal and the bearing first, or within the crankcase shell, rather than bearing on the crankshaft and then seal later. That was the route I took. Now, with this clutch side seal, this seal actually sticks above the edge of the crankcase a little bit, and this acts as the gasket between the crankcase and the oil pump gear case. So you have to be careful not to destroy that. And so you can't just take this Tusk puller and put it right against the seal, because you're going to crush it and damage it and screw it all to hell and make your life miserable. So I MacGyvered, happened to have some steel. Actually, they're already half round, but anyway, this seal is 2 7/8 inch outside diameter. So this collar, spacer if you will, fits right outside that seal and sits directly on the face of the crankcase. So all of my pulling pressure is now going to be on the case and not touching the seal. Now, the Torx tool, however, at least this one in particular, this collar, and I sense that there are different ones available because this will screw off and maybe you can get a wider diameter. Not having one, you have to come up with a means to stop this from going inside, and or a means to allow this to apply pressure to the collar. So in an earlier video you saw me with an old 37 Chevy tool. Here's actually another one. It's called, basically it's just a press plate, and you can MacGyver one out of a piece of steel or whatnot, and it's going to sit like that. Okay, well, first we got to connect the dots. Find a 1/2 inch diameter thread with 20 thread pitch. That's going to screw into the end of your connecting rod. And you'll probably want to screw it in as far as you want, or as far as you can. That's about good enough. And then that adapter screws in. Yep, you know what? I might need to back off that plate, or back off that screw. I guess you can only screw it in as far as your pressure plate. So let's install those pieces. So that's going to slip under there. That's going to slip under there. So if you got a real tight piece, you know, you got to have this adapter up above your plates. So screw the adapter into the puller, and again, grease that up. Your puller is going to go on, and there is a little pin right here that aligns with almost like a keyway in the puller collar. Okay, so we got that all together in one piece, and now our puller nut. Okay, but now let's line our collar up and insert our press plates. So now when you tighten this up, in fact there's not a whole lot there. When you tighten that up, now the pressure is on this plate being transferred to this collar, the spacer, to the crankcase, and it doesn't touch the seal at all. And so here is what I would call a relatively proper assembly procedure and simulates the original Yamaha tool to pull the crankshaft through the clutch side of the crankcase after you've installed the oil seal. So it was posed to me, well, why not put the seal in later? And okay, makes sense. In fact, I think I can leave that on there. But I couldn't figure out how to get around these pins, and they said, well, why didn't you just take them out? And my fear was, not knowing how, I thought they were pressed in there in some way, and I didn't want to ruin a 30 or 40-year-old part that I couldn't get my hands on. So literally about an hour ago, I was just kind of looking at it and thinking, well, am I going to get pliers on it or what? Well, shit, they just grab the damn things and pull them all by hand. So now you can use a press plate. So imagine this seal is not here, and quite possibly this could now go down inside or below here as a snap ring. But otherwise, again, a press plate, or make sure you've got some pulling surface directly against the crankcase. So the only problem here is without that collar, I'm just wondering, will there be enough threads left, which I think there will be, to actually pull that up inside. So that's the clutch side of the crankcase. So the key thing is this pulling tool. I mean, you can MacGyver something together. It's not worth it. Go out and buy one of these, borrow one. I was fortunate friends got one. But again, when you're, especially on the clutch side, this side required a lot more force to draw that crankshaft through the installed bearing and into a seated position. And again, some grease on this nut would help, some grease on the surface of this collar, possibly even a washer in there, or ideally I think is maybe even a bearing. I'm not sure, but that's just an idea. Okay? So without the proper tool, this would have been just a pain in the ass job. I had it mounted horizontally in the vise, clamping against these two bolts that attach it to the frame. Kind of awkward in a horizontal position, but it's the only way that I could kind of hold the crankcase shell in place. So now let's flip it over and take a look at the fan side. Well, we'll try to, because we'll take a look at that. So on the fan side, a suggestion was, so you're going to use the same adapter from the tool, and the suggestion was just put that on there and then take your flywheel nut and thread it on. My concern was that I wasn't engaging 100% of the threads on this nut because of the diameter of this collar, or there's even another one I could try. Wasn't threading on far enough, but anyway. The other issue is, well look, even if that was threaded on further and deeper, it doesn't fit up inside the puller plunger, whatever correct term is. Because my nut measures, I don't know if this is the original nut or not, but essentially to get it up inside this plunger, I would have had to round off the hex points on this nut. So, which I actually did, but I did it very crudely, and Now that will fit up inside this puller plunger, and also it now threads on the crankshaft fully. In fact, I can thread it beyond the end of the crankshaft, and it seats all the way inside this adapter, and just like before, this will screw on. Now in the video, so I can't show you right now without taking off the magneto plate, but if you may need, this will seat, and it's okay for this to totally cover the crankshaft and go down and press directly on the surface of the crankcase shell, because the seal on this side sits flush with the edge of the crankcase, and it's of a slightly smaller diameter where this will sit right on it. So you may or may not need some kind of a spacer, and in my case I found just an old black pipe or galvanized pipe adapter I had in my pile of parts and doodads. So, and this side pulls easier than the other side. So now you see that basically I'm fully engaged on those threads with that little makeshift collar, and now that will thread 100% up inside the puller. Puller goes on over the plunger, and now we're nut. Now, so this would slide down, roughly, let's say 3 inches from where I'm holding it right now. So I'm not sure if I was all the way seated with just this tool down against the, pulling against the connecting rod, down against the crankcase, if there was enough reach left. So that's maybe something you're going to have to play with. Again, I've already got this in place. I don't want to take it back apart, but if you're not getting enough pull, you're going to have to back it out and insert some kind of a spacer. So again, lube this nut up. Now the other thing that I found is, take this apart. Oh, and by the way, this nut, you can search all over town, so to speak, go to the bolt store, the hardware store, and whatever. The threads on it, I believe, were, I think they were 16 millimeter with a pitch of 1.0. Well, it took me half a dozen different stops, and finally somebody suggested, well, go check with the auto parts store and see if they have spindle nuts. So this is actually a spindle nut by Dorman, D-O-R-M-A-N, and I believe from memory the part number is 615-082. And so I picked up a couple of them. Here's a spare. I didn't want to bugger up my original flywheel nut, so that's what I started with, is basically about a $2.50 nut. And since I was there, I got 2 of them. So what you're going to find is that when you pull the clutch side of the crank in, it will eventually seat against that snap ring that's in here. Okay? Then when you pull this side in, you're kind of wondering, well, how far do I need to go? Because if I draw it in too far, then essentially the web is going to hit the crankcase. So what I actually found is, as I drew it this way toward the fan side, I finally hit bottom. And what it actually did, I think, was created a larger gap than on this side than I had before. And I even pulled out, used a feeler gauge and tried my best as I drew it through on the fan side to end up with roughly a similar gap between each crank web and the adjoining crankcase shell. So this bearing here that firmly seats against a bottoming. It bottoms out. There's no place for it to go. You'll know when you get there and when to stop cranking on that bolt or that puller. And at that time, it may, before you reach that dead bottom for this bearing, it may actually be pulling this shaft back through the bearing on the clutch side. So it'll pretty much automatically kind of center itself or position itself, and you really don't have to worry about it. But when I was all said and done, I had almost equal gap between the outside of the crank webs and the crankcase itself. If you do find, one thing I did encounter with this puller is, unlike the original one from Yamaha, from the pictures I've seen, this actually has a handle that sticks out, or a pin, or we'll call it a handle, and I don't know if it screws in or what. But at some point, I actually had to put a pipe wrench on this because the pressure of this nut turning everything, it was under so much pressure that the nut was essentially turning the entire assembly, which in turn turned the crank. So I had to get a pipe wrench on here, and I hope I didn't mar it up too much because it belongs to somebody else. But I had to hold this while I turned the nut. So keep that in mind. This might turn on you, especially in absence of, I didn't put any lube on here. I didn't have a bearing, but it was kind of a lengthy day getting all this together, in part because I had to MacGyver so much stuff together, this collar, and never done it before, never seen it before. So I hope that this video and explanation helps you out in your rebuild. It's not hard. It just takes a little prep time and the right tool. And even if you only use this sucker once, it's well worth it and a hell of a lot cheaper than, I guess, having somebody else do it. And I guess pride and satisfaction of doing it yourself. So again, a Tusk brand puller, T-U-S-K, I believe is the brand name. And again, keep in mind, probably the biggest thing to watch out for, if there are different dimensions available for this motor anyway, I would see if this comes in a larger diameter to accept a larger flywheel nut, and also if this is available in a wider diameter, so that if you're doing it before you install the seal, or even with a collar, that it's wide enough to not have to use a pressure plate or something to fill that gap. So I hope that helps everybody out there, and thanks as well for all the feedback on these videos and my questions, as this is the first 2-cylinder engine I've ever worked on. I've torn apart V8s, straight cylinders, 1937 Chevy, small engines, old tractors, but here's the first, let's say, Oriental engine I've ever worked on. So thanks for watching.